A lot of people think that if you experience or feel gender dysphoria, that necessarily means you're trans. On the other hand, other people say you don't have to experience gender dysphoria to be trans. And of course, there's the DSM diagnosis of gender dysphoria, and there's also the way people use that term more colloquially to describe their experiences. So, what does gender dysphoria really mean? Whether we're talking about the formal diagnosis or the informal way people use the term, gender dysphoria is described as the distress a person feels when their gender identity doesn't align with their birth sex. And regarding that distress here, we could go even further to say it's a series of unpleasant thoughts and feelings. I know that's still really broad, but stick with me here. Something a lot of people misunderstand is that even formal diagnoses from the DSM are simply a cluster of symptoms and experiences that occur together. Diagnoses tell us very little on their own about the particular person who has them, how the symptoms developed, and the context in which they developed. And these are all very important pieces of information to understand so that we can get to the nature of the person's suffering. It's like showing up to the doctor's office with a fever. You have a symptom, but you and the doctor still have to figure out what caused the fever so that you can respond in the most helpful way. This idea is applicable to mental health or psychiatric diagnoses too. So as a therapist, I think it's really important that we take the time to explore and understand the individual person's inner world, their thoughts and feelings, and the experiences that make up their difficulties, including when it comes to gender dysphoria. And look, we have to stop pretending that gender dysphoria only has one meaning, because I can guarantee that you personally have encountered lots of different meanings in your own dysphoria, and I bet you've noticed that gender dysphoria has different meanings for others as well. And as you know by now, on this channel, we examine gender as a rich and interesting metaphor, and doing so gives us new ways to think about and understand dysphoria. So, welcome to the metaphor of gender. I'm Sasha, a therapist, and this channel is for curious people who prefer deep thinking over dogma. We explore identity, meaning, and how to live life well. So let's continue looking today at the concept of gender dysphoria from a lot of different angles. And actually, I want to start with a definition that you're probably familiar with, what it means to be trans. Being trans, we're told, is when your personal internal identity doesn't match your male or female body or the associated roles of male or female. Which sounds pretty clear and straightforward, right? Until you start asking, what exactly makes someone have a different gender identity than their body? What kinds of thoughts, feelings, and lived experiences might cause this kind of disconnect? Or is it just innate, permanent, and a fundamental part of who you are? And what if you've only started thinking about it lately? Does that mean it was always a part of you anyway? And what about feeling like your identity doesn't match the roles associated with your sex? How much does it not have to match? Like 5% or 95%? And what if you actually disagree with those roles in the first place? Is that considered a mismatch of identity, or is that just a philosophical disagreement? And also, which male and female roles are we talking about? The roles according to whom? And when? Like roles today or in 1973? And also, roles where? The roles in the United States? Okay, are we talking about Manhattan or Mississippi? What about the roles in Afghanistan or Denmark? What if a person travels to different places? Does their state of being trans change? Look, these are all really fascinating questions to explore more fully. But for today, I'd like to just zoom in on that feeling of gender dysphoria and the different meanings that it could have. You know, I've learned a lot from the young people in my therapy practice, and I've noticed that they all have different versions of what their gender dysphoria feels like to them. It's worth keeping in mind that dysphoria, just that word by itself, simply means a state of feeling very unhappy, uneasy, or dissatisfied. Now, the mismatch and incongruence part of gender dysphoria is a concept that's evolved over time as definitions have changed. But ultimately, we're talking about being unhappy, uneasy, or dissatisfied with one's body or the typical roles associated with their sex. But let's go even deeper to the emotional and visceral experience. Some people find that gender dysphoria is like a sharp, aching disconnect from their physical sex. Sometimes it's very targeted discomfort with particular body parts that signal male or female. However, gender dysphoria can also just feel like being an outsider or an alien. Like other people of your sex seem to have unifying experiences and understanding that you just can't grasp. Some people just know that they don't want to be the sex they were born into. I often hear people say things like, "I'm not sure that I'm a guy, I just know I'm not a girl." Think about this. For some people, taking on a different identity could help them feel more visible, powerful, and confident. But for others, it could mean almost the exact opposite, by helping them to feel less noticeable, more normal, or more able to blend in. So these are all very different impulses and drivers behind someone's gender dysphoria and their identity. So a new identity and transition can serve very different needs and have very different outcomes. And even though we just covered a few examples, of which there could be hundreds and hundreds, it's interesting that all those different drivers, needs, feelings, thoughts, and outcomes get lumped together and interpreted the same way. Same words, same labels, gender dysphoria or being transgender, but they represent completely different internal and external realities. Honestly, I think this is exactly why you hear some people say there's no right or wrong way to be trans. I get how that makes sense here. But if that's the case, does gender dysphoria have a meaningful, stable definition? Does being transgender have a meaningful, stable definition? Could it be that everyone gets to use the same terms to describe wildly different experiences? Here's the dilemma. When a huge and broad range of experiences are all defined with the same label, that could be fine if we were also told that a huge, broad range of ways to understand and work with your experiences exist, having a broad behavioral repertoire. But you know what happens to all these different people with all these different experiences? They're encouraged to go down the exact same formulaic pathway. Accept that you're trans, socially transition, use a new name, new pronouns, and maybe even medical interventions. So you see, that just doesn't make sense. Because sure, that formulaic pathway works great for some people. But guess what happens if that same pathway doesn't work for someone, or they change their mind, or they actually end up feeling like the pathway harmed them? Well, they're told they were never really trans in the first place. It's like, wait, I thought there's no right or wrong way to be trans. And didn't you tell me that if I'm asking myself these questions about identity, that I should experiment with pronouns and try out a new identity, and that hormones would help me feel more authentic? Look, these days, everybody knows someone who identified as trans or as the opposite sex or a non-binary identity at some point and then changed their mind. And I think it's really unfair to tell people they were never really trans or blame them for being confused or acting like their experiences are not real or valid. Because I can guarantee they had real and valid struggles with their identity and their body when they were identifying as trans. And they likely experienced real and valid discrimination in some contexts when they identified as trans. They were likely part of real and valid communities when they identified as trans because they wanted to feel accepted, understood, and validated. And look, if they took actual medical steps or had physical interventions like binders or surgeries or hormones, then they also experienced a physically challenging and sometimes painful process. Those are all very real trade-offs that people had to deal with. So when people say they were never really trans, that's an attempt to deny people's real personal and lived experiences. It just doesn't make sense to say, if you say you're trans, then you are, until you run into errors in the formulaic pathway. You know, there's a name for this. This is called the no true Scotsman fallacy. This is a logical error that occurs when someone modifies a generalization to protect it from counterexamples by redefining the term to exclude the counterexamples. In this case, detransitioners are the counterexample, and the fallacy occurs when people redefine the term trans to exclude anyone who has detransitioned or changed their mind. The point is, while I love flexible thinking and philosophical exploration, we do have to be precise and clear. These definitions are not logically cohesive because they work just fine until they don't. How we define things has tangible and lasting effects on our choices and our lives. Now, of course, these same definitions that I'm talking about being trans or gender dysphoria, do work perfectly well for some people and continue to work for them. So how do we reconcile that? Well, first, I think with greater psychological flexibility, looking at this from different angles. Coming up in a future video, I want to share how I've come to define being trans. But before we get there, I think it would help to start with a very simple question. What causes gender dysphoria? And that's what we'll cover in our next several videos, so please be sure you're subscribed to get the notification. Okay, that's it for today. Keeping one foot in reality and one in possibility. I'll see you next time. Hey, if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. That really helps me to keep this channel going. And please tell me your thoughts below. To join me in exploring more interesting questions, click on this video. Thanks and see you next time. This information is meant for educational purposes only and not as a substitute for mental health services.